Wars aren't always won with superior armies. Sometimes it takes a mix of bluffing, bravery, and sheer luck, qualities both sides possessed in the War of 1812. Last week, we saw how unpreparedness and tensions sparked the war. Today, we're plunging into one of its earliest battles. Get ready for daring river crossings, cunning tactics, and the rise of an iconic, yet tragic, Canadian hero. From the icy plains where indigenous nations thrived long before the settlers arrived, to the battle smoke of the War of 1812, Canada's stories echo through time. We know the legends, Vimy Ridge, the birth of Confederation, the Summit Series that stole a nation's heart. But history isn't carved solely from grand moments. In every corner of this vast land, lesser-known tales linger. Forgotten heroes, struggles echoing in local lore, moments that shaped communities but faded from the national stage. This podcast is a journey of rediscovery. I'm no scholar, just a captivated explorer. My goal isn't to lecture, but to ignite. If my tales spark a flicker of curiosity in you, then I've succeeded. So settle in. Adventure awaits in the echoes of time. This is Canadian History with Stephen Wilson. When the United States issued the declaration of war to start the War of 1812, it had caught everyone by surprise, including the Americans. The tensions between the two nations had been building for 5 years and was primarily a diplomatic dispute over issues such as embargoes, impressment, and trade with indigenous tribes on the northwestern frontier of the United States. We covered many of these in last week's episode, so you can go back to the previous episode if you are joining us late and bring yourself up to speed. Now, the British certainly weren't looking for a war. They were already embroiled in one with France. Much of the British army was already in the Iberian Peninsula, fighting the French in the Napoleonic Wars that encompassed Europe for much of the past 12 years. There were few troops to spare to reinforce the North American front, where there were just over 6,000 British troops in Canada at the outset of the war. Now, there were some Canadian militia. These were volunteers who would be able to fight in the defense of their homes. With this manpower situation in mind, the British War Secretary Earl Bathurst urged Lieutenant General George Prevost to take a defensive strategy at the outset of the war. These instructions were followed, but with the forces focusing on the defense of Lower Canada. After all, this was a place that had been previously invaded by the Americans during the Revolutionary War, where they were successful in capturing Montreal and besieging Quebec. Now, there was no support from the Royal Navy, aside from what was available from the North American station in Halifax and the station in Bermuda. While they were the ones who declared war to begin with, the Americans themselves were woefully unprepared for a war. Their army included a force of less than 12,000 men. There were another 35,000 authorized by Congress, but this was a tough sell to the American public. Militiamen were reluctant to serve outside their home state, and many outright refused to cross the border and fight on Canadian soil. The war itself was also unpopular in many parts of the United States, particularly New England. Financing was also an issue, with the United States having to cover their overseas bond obligations by getting financing from Barings Bank in London, England. The states in New England also refused to provide financial support themselves or any militia units during the war. There were even calls for New England to secede from the Union. Now, the first major engagement, if we can call it that, happened on July 17, 1812, the Battle of Fort Mackinac. This saw the British take the fort on Mackinac Island without firing a single shot. While it was the first engagement, there had already been some military maneuvering before that. The Americans actually made the first advance into Canadian territory 5 days earlier, when William Hull led an untrained, poorly disciplined group of militiamen across the Detroit River, landing near what is now called Windsor, Ontario. When he arrived in Sandwich, which was what Windsor was called at the time, he issued a proclamation calling for all the British subjects to surrender, offering them protection of persons, property, and rights if they did not raise force against the Americans. Hull wrote in his proclamation as a warning, "If, contrary to your own interest and the just expectation of my country, you should take part in the approaching contest, you will be considered and treated as enemies, and the horrors and calamities of war will stalk before you. If the barbarous and savage policy of Great Britain be pursued, and the savages be let loose to murder our citizens and murder our women and children, this war will be a war of extermination. The first stroke of the tomahawk, the first attempt with the scalping knife, will be the signal for one indiscriminate scene of desolation. No white man fighting by the side of an Indian will be taken prisoner. Instant destruction will be his lot." Now, was this enough to encourage the people of Sandwich to surrender? No, not by a long shot. The call for surrender was met with stiff resistance from the Canadian militia. Hull found himself biting off more than he could chew, and then he also learned of the capture of Mackinac. This would take away a passage along Lake Huron through which supplies and reinforcements for Hull could arrive. Hull moved on from Sandwich and advanced on Fort Malden near Amherstburg. There, around 200 men under the command of a Captain Muir were stationed along with artillery. The fort itself would not likely stand up to a lengthy siege, so the militia looked to launch a sortie instead of giving up without offering any resistance whatsoever. Then the Americans launched attempts to take the fort on 3 consecutive days, July 18th, 19th, and 20th, and all 3 attempts were repulsed. The Queen Charlotte, a 20-gun boat, also stayed anchored at the mouth of the Canard River, and that was used to help keep the enemy in check. While the garrison at Amherstburg was doing what it could to keep the Americans at bay, General Isaac Brock dispatched reinforcements under the command of a Colonel Proctor. The British arrived as the Americans were falling back across the Detroit River on August 6th, and the reason for this withdrawal? A group of indigenous warriors under the command of Tecumseh had ambushed the American rearguard on the U.S. side of the river, disrupting the supply line. With the Americans being pushed back, the British moved on to the offensive. Brock headed for Amherstburg himself and arrived on August 13th. He would also be joined by 200 indigenous warriors under the command of Tecumseh. When Brock arrived, he learned from captured dispatches that the morale on the American side was low, as they feared not just the British, but also the number of indigenous warriors who would be accompanying them, as well the Americans were short on supply. Now, Tecumseh and Brock hit it off by all accounts. Brock wrote of the indigenous leader, "A more sagacious and more gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist." Now, the 2 men met at Fort Malden, and Tecumseh was described as wearing 3 coronets from the lower cartilage of his nose, along with a large silver medallion with the likeness of King George III. He was wearing a fringed deerskin shirt and leggings with moccasins on his feet, very much a different look than the very dignified appearance of the British officers in their red jackets. When Brock saw Tecumseh, he crossed the floor to shake his hand and exclaimed, "2 strong men stood face to face, though they came from the ends of the earth." Now, during the discussions on whether to attack Fort Detroit, Brock's officers were against the idea. After all, they were supposed to be taking a more defensive posture than offensive. Brock, however, stated they would be attacking Detroit. Tecumseh looked at the other chiefs present with him in the room, as well as the officers on the British side, and then pointed at Brock and proclaimed, "This is a man." After the coming battle at Detroit, Tecumseh would receive a tasseled scarlet sash from Brock, placing it upon the warrior chief in front of his men, and in return Tecumseh presented Brock with the sash himself. When Brock was killed just a few months later in combat, he was wearing the sash he received from Tecumseh. It's also worth noting that Brock was willing to work with the indigenous peoples of the area, not just as allies for the war, but afterwards too. Brock, if he had survived the war, would have likely advocated for the indigenous confederacy Tecumseh was promoting. Now that would be the subject of another episode in the coming weeks. Back to the narrative. With Detroit on the other side of the river, the British set about devising a plan of attack. Brock wanted to attack right away, even though, as mentioned, the officers weren't necessarily in favor of it. The plan that was developed would be one of intrigue and guile. Knowing of the fears that the American soldiers had of the indigenous allies of the British, a misleading letter just happened to end up in the hands of the forces in Detroit. The letter asked that no more indigenous warriors be sent from Fort Mackinac, as supplies were already running short at Amherstburg with the 5,000 already there. Then this letter was followed up by one from Brock to Hull, demanding surrender. The force at my disposal authorizes me to require of you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my intention to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond control the moment the contest commences. The British would go about creating the illusion of a larger force than they really had. The militia were given old uniforms of the British regulars from the 41st Regiment, so it looked like they were more professional soldiers. Instead of lighting one fire per unit, the men were ordered to light multiple fires for themselves. And when marching up to a position, they would duck behind entrenchments, then scurry to the back of the line and repeat. It's easy to imagine the whole arrangement looking like something we would see in an episode of Looney Tunes with Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck trying to confuse Elmer Fudd. In fact, I'm pretty sure they did something like that in an episode at one point in time. So what did the British actually have available? Well, according to the report from Brock afterwards, there were 600 indigenous warriors, 1,300 soldiers, and 2 warships. The British would get their artillery into position on August 15th, setting up in the Canadian side of the river, and they would use the grounds of the Francois Baby House, which is where Hull himself had put his headquarters during his abortive venture onto the Canadian side. The guns began to shell into Fort Detroit. Then the next day, Tecumseh and his men crossed, followed by Brock and around 300 men plus 5 field guns. Tecumseh would parade his men several times past a gap in the forest, continuing the impression that there were more men than there really were. I mean, if it was working, why change anything? And while Tecumseh's men did this, Brock then moved against the rear of Fort Detroit. As the British forces were moving into position to launch the assault, a shell hit the officers' mess inside the fort. This was the shell that killed Lieutenant Porter Hanks. He was the officer charged with cowardice for the surrender of Fort Mackinac. General Hull contemplated surrender. He had 2,500 soldiers and 700 civilians inside the fort, including his own daughter. He believed they were vastly outnumbered. Against the advice of his officers, Hull hoisted a flag of surrender and sent a message to Brock asking for 3 days to negotiate terms of surrender. The response from Brock: "You have 3 hours." Hull surrendered his entire force. In all, 7 Americans were killed, while 2 British artillerymen were wounded. The British would capture 33 cannon, 300 rifles, 2,500 muskets, and the only armed American ship on the upper Great Lakes. Hull's conduct would later see him face a court-martial. The charges were of cowardice and neglect of duty. He was found guilty and sentenced to be shot. His sentence, though, would be commuted by President James Madison to simple dismissal from the Army in recognition of his service to the nation during the Revolutionary War. The victory would help to cement the reputation of Isaac Brock as the hero of Upper Canada, as he now looked to find other ways to keep the Americans on their toes. Let's take a few moments to look at who Sir Isaac Brock was. For many of us here in the 21st century, the name is at least familiar. There's the city of Brockville in Ontario and Brock University in St. Catharines. There are public schools across all the provinces named in honor of Brock, as well as towns in Ontario and Saskatchewan. Suffice to say, his name lives on in Canada. Brock hailed from Guernsey, one of the Channel Islands. His father was a midshipman in the Royal Navy, and his mother, the daughter of the Lieutenant Bailiff of Guernsey. He would go to school in Southampton and spent 1 year learning French in Rotterdam. At the age of 15, Brock joined the 8th King's Regiment of Foot with the rank of ensign. His brother John was already an officer in the same regiment. In 1790, Brock bought the rank of lieutenant, as it was customary practice to purchase a commission at the time. With his rank, Brock would raise his own company of men and was promoted to captain in 1791. 6 months later, he would be transferred to the 49th Regiment of Foot. When he arrived there, he would make an impression. A story told of Brock by his nephew Ferdinand Tupper Brock was that he was challenged to a duel by a professional duelist shortly after joining the 49th. As the person who was challenged, Brock would be the one to choose the terms, and so he chose pistols. This was a surprise to many, as Brock was described as a fairly tall man with a sturdy frame. Many thought it would just fisticuffs or swords or something. But Brock, however, insisted on pistols, but then also insisted that the duel would take place at handkerchief distance, literally across the width of a handkerchief. The duelist declined, and the incident boosted Brock's popularity and reputation. Brock would go on to see some time in the Caribbean, where he would fall ill and return to England. He then purchased the rank of major in 1795, then lieutenant colonel in 1797. This would see him become the acting commanding officer of the 49th. His regiment would be part of the Helder expedition in 1799, where he would see his first combat. Brock would be wounded during the Battle of Alkmaar, taking a musket ball in the neck. In 1801, his unit was supposed to lead the assault during the Battle of Copenhagen. The sea battle that preceded the landings, however, made the assault unnecessary, and then a year later, the 49th would be deployed to Canada. Arriving in Montreal, Brock would have to deal with issues such as desertion and mutiny among the soldiers stationed there. He would deal with desertion in Montreal and then mutiny at Fort St. George in Upper Canada. Promoted to colonel in 1806, Brock was placed, temporarily, in command of all British forces in Canada. Now, he read the room and noted emerging tensions between Britain and the United States, so Brock started to bolster the defenses in Upper and Lower Canada. First, he strengthened the fortifications at Quebec. Then, he ordered the construction of a naval force for the Great Lakes. In 1807, Brock was appointed Brigadier General by the Governor-General of Canada at the time, Sir James Henry Craig. In 1811, Brock became the Major General and was sent to Upper Canada that fall as the senior commander of the troops and the senior member of the Executive Council. Facing opposition from the legislature in Upper Canada, Brock continued to plan for the possibility of war with the United States. This included amending the Militia Act to allow the use of volunteers and to train them as well. As we mentioned before, Brock also became well known for his conduct towards his Indigenous allies. He made several commitments to the Shawnee, including to not negotiate a peace treaty unless it addressed an independent homeland for them. Based on Brock's own writings, his integrity, and his respect for the Indigenous peoples, it is very likely this would have become a reality if he had have survived the war. After the capture of Detroit, Brock found himself at odds with his superior, Sir George Prevost. Prevost wanted a more cautious approach to the war, while Brock wanted to take the fight to the Americans in America. Brock wanted to cross the Niagara River and occupy upstate New York. Prevost, meanwhile, wanted to take a defensive course of action, noting that the orders in council, which were among the grievances of the Americans, had been revoked. Prevost even opened negotiations with American General Henry Dearborn, who is the commander-in-chief of the United States Army. These negotiations would lead to local armistices. The American government, though, would reject them and ordered Dearborn to resume hostilities. Brock returned to the Niagara region on August 22nd, where an armistice was in effect, negotiated between Major General Roger Hale Sheaffe on the British side and Colonel Solomon Van Rensselaer. The Americans, who were planning to cross the Niagara as one of 4 prongs of attack into the Canadas, used the armistice to supply. And when the armistice ended on September 8th, they were all prepared for the invasion. On the American side of the Niagara, though, things weren't going well. Major General Stephen Van Rensselaer, second cousin of the colonel who had negotiated the treaty with Sheaffe, was in command of the main American force that was going to cross the Niagara. A flashback to the invasion of Quebec during the Revolutionary War. A key figure in the early stages of the failed invasion of Quebec was Philip Schuyler, father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. Van Rensselaer is also connected to the Schuyler family, as his first wife was Schuyler's daughter, Margarita, or Peggy. And interestingly enough, Van Rensselaer's great-great-grandson is David Crosby of Crosby, Stills, and Nash fame. Back to the story. At the beginning of September, Van Rensselaer had 691 men under his command, all of whom were unpaid volunteers. He would receive reinforcements, though, from regulars of the United States Army, some more volunteers and militiamen. He also had under his command a force of 1,700 men who were under Brigadier General Alexander Smith. Smith, though, refused to obey Van Rensselaer. Let's take a look at the relationship between the two, as it would play a factor in how things would unfold in the coming weeks. Van Rensselaer was a major general in the New York State militia, but had never actually served in combat and was a politician, not a soldier. At the beginning of the war, he was the leading Federalist candidate for governor of New York. The current governor of New York, Daniel Tompkins, had put Van Rensselaer's name forward to command the army in the Niagara region, and he secured his cousin's appointment as his aide-de-camp. His cousin, an experienced soldier, having fought in the Northwest Wars and was wounded at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Smith, on the other hand, was a professional soldier, serving in the United States Army first as a colonel and inspector general, before being promoted to brigadier general in July of 1812. When Smith arrived with his men near the frontier, he set up camp near Buffalo at the head of the river. The rest of the force under Van Rensselaer was at Lewiston. The plan was for Van Rensselaer to cross at Lewiston and take the heights near Queenston, while Smith crossed near Fort Niagara and attacked Fort George. This order was sent to Smith, and no reply came back to Van Rensselaer. A summons was issued for a war council of all of the officers to plan the attack, and this too received no reply. Another direct order was issued to Smith, telling him to come to Van Rensselaer as quickly as possible, and it was also ignored. Under normal circumstances, this would have resulted in the superior officer ordering a court-martial of the subordinate, and a new officer put in place. But Van Rensselaer, the consummate politician, played nice and chose to not take that path, as it could potentially delay the attack on Upper Canada. Instead, he opted to not have the two-pronged attack across the Niagara, and instead launched the attack from Lewiston on Queenston himself, without the aid of Smith. On October 9th, the Americans launched an attack on two British ships, the Caledonia and the Detroit, which were anchored near Fort Detroit. These ships were captured, although the Detroit was set on fire to prevent it from being recaptured. Now, hearing of this attack and fearing the Americans were about to cross at Buffalo, Brock hurried to Fort Erie. Once he realized there was no fear of an attack from Smith, he returned to Niagara that night. Brock's trip, though, was reported to Van Rensselaer that the British commander was heading back to Detroit, which the Americans were trying to recover. Knowing this, Van Rensselaer decided he'd launch the attack on Queenston in the early morning hours of October 11th. On the 10th, to prepare for the attack, Van Rensselaer sent orders again to Smith, this time ordering him to join his forces in Lewiston. Smith set out this time, but took the worst route possible. And things weren't helped with the weather, as Lewiston soldiers were left waiting to embark in their boats in the rain. And then one of the boats deserted with all of the oars that were needed for the rest of the boats going with them. The attack would have to be called off by the Americans, and it was attempted again on the 13th. At least that's what the decision was made. Now, upon hearing that the attack from Lewiston was delayed, Smith wrote to Van Rensselaer that his troops would be in condition to move out again on October 14th. You'd almost think that Smith wanted the attack to fail at this point. On the British side, Brock knew of the failed attempt to cross, but wanted to make sure it wasn't a ruse. He had Major Thomas Evans cross the river on October 12th under a white flag to request an exchange of prisoners. When he arrived on the American side, he asked to speak with Colonel Van Rensselaer, but was told he was sick. He was then directed to speak with a man who claimed to be the secretary of General Van Rensselaer, named Tuke. This Tuke, who is believed to have been Major John Lovett in disguise, repeatedly told the British officer that no exchanges could be made until the day after tomorrow. The insistence of phrasing it that way, along with boats hidden in the brush along the shore, had Evans believe the attack was imminent. He returned to the British side, where many of the officers laughed off his theory. Brock, though, would take him aside for a private meeting and Evans was able to convince his commanding officer. Brock sent the orders to the militia to assemble. And so our journey through this chapter of the War of 1812 ends. In our next episode, we'll look at the first major battle of the War of 1812 and what would be considered one of the most pivotal battles in Canadian history, the Battle of Queenston Heights. Thank you for traveling alongside me. If these stories sparked a question, a memory, or just a newfound fascination, let's keep the conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more history, and give us a like if you enjoyed the ride. Thank you for listening to Canadian History with Stephen Wilson.